Hey, Identiverse happened July 10th. Passwordless auth goes into public preview for managed AAD tenants, so you can check that out. I would love to have Skim and Libby both give presentations here. So this deck is about optional claims and claims mapping. There's sometimes a lot of confusion about which one you should use where for your applications. So we'll dive into what each one does, how to set them up, and answer your questions. If you have questions, just throw them into chat. We've got a small enough group that we should just be able to handle that. So optional claims. Optional claims exist on basically all users across all tenants for all applications. There's no guarantee that those applications, or sorry, that those users will actually have the optional claims, but generically they are possible to exist across all of these users. That contrasts heavily with claims mapping, which is very tenant-specific information, typically focused on business logic. So those might be things like your employee ID, which might have a completely different format across companies. Here, ours at Microsoft is a set of numbers about 8 digits long, but at another company, it might be letters and numbers or just your first and last name with a dot in between. For that reason, optional claims are controlled by the application across tenants because they can expect this data to show up from AAD in a controlled format and have an expectation that it actually may exist when relevant, whereas claims mapping is controlled by the tenant. This means that for every application that you want to receive a mapped claim, you have to set some policy and indicate this service principal, not even this application ID, should receive these mapped claims. We'll talk a little bit about why that distinction of control is important here. So similar to how they're controlled by the application, optional claims are very specific to the client or web API. So we'll talk about in a minute how these tokens are issued and how we decide what optional claims go in where. Versus claims mapping, where you can say, I've migrated a whole bunch of line of business applications to the cloud. All of them expect to have a conference room claim inside of the ID token. So here, all of these applications are now going to get a conference room claim. And then there's kind of why these exist. Optional claims are here because our tokens were getting too large. They weren't fitting inside of cookies as easily anymore. And there was just a ton of unnecessary data coming into these into these tokens. So we started removing it and saying, if you need it, ask for it. Claims mapping, on the other hand, is all about migration of on-premises apps to the cloud. So you have some line of business apps that have a whole bunch of funky logic there around all of the custom claims that your ADFS instance has. We are going to help move those to the cloud and not have to change a whole bunch of your auth logic at the same time that you're trying to migrate a whole ecosystem. So let's talk about optional claims first. Another eye chart. Optional claims change on what's available based on the type of user that's signing in, the endpoint that you're using to sign them in, the version of the token that you're receiving, which, as we saw 2 weeks ago, is not necessarily connected to the endpoint that you're talking to, and whether you're using SAML or OAuth for your authentication. I'll call out that while optional claims are supported on V2 application registrations, which means that they are supported for both MSA and AAD users, a lot of optional claims, as you'll see in a minute, don't make sense for MSA, which is why they just don't show up in the tokens. If you ask for their tenant's preferred language or the country that the tenant prefers their data to be stored in, that doesn't mean anything for a personal Microsoft account because they don't have a tenant necessarily. They have the public mega tenant that doesn't have an admin. You can apply these to both JOTs and SAMLs, and we'll look in a minute how to set that. And this is the biggest one that always trips people up when they are trying to set optional claims, and that is Optional claims are triggered based on the audience of the token. So we see this a lot. People will say, I want the access tokens that this application requests to have the IP address in it. So they go set it, they type that in as the client ID, they request a token for graph, and then they break the cardinal rule of authentication, which is don't look inside the access token. They look inside the access token and they say, hey, there's no IP address in here. Oh yeah, because Graph didn't request the IP address of the user in their tokens. So we didn't put it there. So when you're testing optional claims in access tokens, be sure that you're requesting the application where you've set that optional claim as the resource or the scope, not just as the client ID, because otherwise it won't show up. The reason for this is optional claims are really important for authentication scenarios, and if you could control the claims that show up in a token that you're sending to somebody else, you could break them really easily, which is why we don't build tokens like that. The resource is always in control of the tokens that are minted for them. So what kind of optional claims are available? Why would we even do this? There's a whole bunch of claims that exist for all kinds of tokens, so SAML, V1, V2, and those are things like the session ID, SID, the authentication time, so what time the user actually interactively signed in, the country that the user is from, their email address, their preferred language or the tenant preferred language, which is that XMS TPL item down there. Account, so this is a Boolean flag that indicates whether or not they are a guest or a member inside of the tenant that you've requested the token for. This is a whole bunch of just extra information that might be useful to you, but if it's not useful to you, is an extra 10 to 12 bytes that is going to show up in your tokens forever, and that's why it's not there. With V2, so this is tokens that are ID tokens that are issued by the V2 endpoint, or access tokens that are issued to resources that are requesting V2 version tokens. We removed a lot of the V1 standard claims from the V2 tokens because they were just taking up room and weren't that useful. Things like first and last name, family name, and given name. In V2, it's just a display name now, which is first name plus last name. If you really need their first name or the last name, you can just request it here again. UPN works the same way. And this list is pretty short for now. And for the most part, you'll see the list on the left growing, not on the right. Just to pop into the documentation real fast. This is on docs.microsoft.com under Configure Optional Claims. And you can see that there's a big list with descriptions of where these tokens, what kind of tokens that these claims can be injected into, whether or not they support MSA accounts as well as AAD accounts, and information about the format or what this actually looks like. There's also a special kind of optional claim which has additional properties effectively. These are claims that normally show up in tokens anyway, but your application may request, hey, I want these claims to look a little bit different, typically because you are, again, a legacy application that's been migrated to the cloud and needs data handed to it in a different way. So that's for the groups claim and the UPN claim. I'm very happy to see that the groups claim additional properties are finally out. So the most important thing, and I've seen a lot of asks for this, is that typically when you get the groups claim, it's a list of all of the groups that the user is in as their object IDs. So the object IDs of the group. So it's just a giant list of GUIDs. But a lot of applications do string matching against the name of the group traditionally. And so using the additional properties on the group's optional claim, you can say, I want the list of names of the groups that this user is in, so that you can continue doing string matching. Note that this does involve adding a bit of a security risk here, because the group called, printer admins or something in my tenant that is synced from on-premises AD may not be the same meaning as one from another tenant. So be aware that this can have some risk associated with it, but it's really handy for single tenant applications that are migrating from on-prem. You can also do things like, again, for migrating from on-prem, inject the groups as the roles claim. This does remove any kind of application roles that the user has, but if your application expects groups to show up in the roles claim, there you go. That's where it'll show up. The UPN claim is sort of the same. UPN shows up inside of V1 tokens by default, but for guest users, you can also request that, hey, give me the UPN and really indicate that this is a guest user by doing that #ext hash that you may have seen before in some of the tokens that you've received. You can also just use the UPN optional claim to make it show up inside of V2 tokens. So here's an example of what that looks like. You can see that for ID tokens requested by this application, the auth time will show up inside of the token. If this application also happens to surface a web API, then anytime any application requests an access token for this web API, the IP address will show up, but it won't show up inside of the ID tokens that this application requests because it's not inside of the ID token claim. Finally, if this application also happens to be using SAML, which it's now a very interesting application, it's requesting this extension claim here, which we'll touch on in a minute. Extension claims are application-specific data that the application has added to the user object using AAD graph. So this only works for AAD. This only works for the application that is getting the token. And so you can't share this across applications. And it's used for, hey, I've got some additional piece of important authentication-related information that I need to add to this user object, and I want you to give it back to me inside of the tokens. This is really powerful for things like mapping users in AAD against an identifier they have in another identity system. That's probably the major use for it. But there's APIs that you can use in AAD graph to add these objects, and then it'll show up inside of the SAML token if you request it. Just to touch on the syntax here that you saw on the last page, the name is one of the optional claims, so SID or auth_time, or the extension claim as you saw in the SAML one. Extension claims work for all types of tokens. I just happen to put it there in the SAML token. The source, in the future, this is a lot of this stuff that you've seen here is future proofing related to the way that the OAuth standard handles optional claims or requestable claims. So today the source is always user. You can just leave it out because it defaults to user. But in the future we could see it sort of like in claims mapping, saying this is a claim that should come from the application or the resource or even the tenant itself. Essential, similarly, it's effectively always false, but what the essential flag means is that if the user doesn't have this claim and AAD or MSA has a way of forcing the user to accrue this claim, then before we issue a token for your application, we'll force them to add this bit of data to their account. The only place that this actually works today is on the email claim in MSA on V2. So if you sign a user in on V2, they happen to have an MSA, and they don't have an email address, and you have set the email claim as essential, then before the user signs in, they'll see a bit of dialogue that says, you need to add an email address to your account, you need to verify it, and then once you do that, you'll get the email claim inside of your token. This is really nice if you absolutely have to have an email inside of your application. Otherwise, it won't function. That's really useful for things like know your customer, where you have to have a contact information available. Finally, additional properties. As I mentioned, those are for the groups and UPN claims only. Take another peek at the documentation. Wait for this to scroll. You can see here that we've edited the groups additional properties to include, put these in the roles claim and use the net BIOS name and the SAM account name from my on-premises AD as the name of this group instead of using the object ID. A lot of this stuff is, if you know what it means, great, you'll probably figure out how to use it. If you don't know what it means, you probably don't need to use it because you're not dealing with on-premises AD migration. So let's talk extension claims. Like I said, these are AAD only. They're on the user object only, set by the audience application. They can only be set via AAD graph, which is why they're AAD only. And just a question out to the audience, is this something that you've actually seen before and that you've been disappointed that this wasn't supported in MSA? We're trying to figure out if this is actually something we need to migrate over to MS Graph and have it available for all applications. So if you could just type in the chat whether or not this is something that you care about. Okay. Interesting. So I might follow up with some folks just to figure out what your scenarios are there and understand how it is that you're trying to use this, particularly if it's blocking you from moving to V2 and supporting MSA users in your applications. Thank you. All right, claims mapping. So claims mapping is set as a policy. It can target any number of service principals in a tenant, and it's mostly just for migrating business logic from on-premises line of business apps into the cloud. So if you're building a brand new application, please just use Graph. A lot of the information that you need is probably already there. And a lot of this will not work for you unless you are migrating stuff from AD. So you've got the whole sync and connect work set up there. There's a bit of a richer set of sources that you can get claim data from. So with optional claims, it was only users, but for claims mapping, you can add applications, resources, audiences, the user, or the company itself. The company here just means the tenant, but similar to optional claims, most of these come from the user object. Some fields that you can take from the user object and map into your tokens are the employee ID. There is a field for it in the AAD user object, but it's not filled in by default. It has to be synced in. They have alternate mail addresses. The user principal name and the on-premises account name both exist, which are different from the UPN. And again, this is really helpful for migrating your on-prem stuff to the cloud. And finally, there's 15 extension attributes. Literally, they're just called extension attribute 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 15. And those are just places that you park data for your tenant whenever you are starting to migrate up to the cloud. There's 15 because, sort of like Bill Gates never said, 640K ought to be enough for anybody. 15 ought to be enough for whatever it is that you're using. If it's not, we're really interested in finding out that that's the case for you. If you happen to have 16 distinct chunks of data across your tenant that map to every user, then 15 won't be enough. We're interested in finding out why. One of the reasons that this is set per tenant is that even though employee IDs or the office that you're sitting in, or what building you reside in, those might be things that exist in multiple tenants, but whenever the admin was setting up the AD Connect sync, In tenant 1, they may have put that into extension 1, but in another tenant, they might have put it into extension 3, which is why tenants 1 and 2, or A and B, need different policies written by their admin. What you'll see typically is that for LOB applications, everybody just kind of knows, all right, yep, we put this value that my app needs in extension 1, so go request extension 1. But you'll also see multi-tenant applications that existed on-prem that are now migrating to the cloud, and they just say, hey, I expect this bit of data, set up the mapping correctly so that I get it from your extension data or from wherever else you're storing it. And typically those multi-tenant apps or enterprise apps will guide you through that setup flow. We also have a claims transformations option. If you're familiar with on-prem AD, this will look pretty sparse to you because claims mapping on premises has a ton of different options. Here we just have join and extract mail prefix. So join it's string.join. Take two pieces of arbitrary information. They can be references to other claims. They could be references to other transformations, and join it with another set of stuff. Yeah, Jeff, that's exactly the problem. Typically this isn't, so just the comment here about extension attributes get confusing. Yeah, they are on premises and hopefully they have migrated up to the cloud, and you've just got to go find your identity people, as you say. Hopefully they've written some documentation, they've helped your developers set up that migration. We don't have a great way of exposing that right now in a self-service manner. If that's something that's causing problems though for folks, we'd be interested in figuring out how we can make these extension attributes more usable without having to just go find the identity people, which I only happen to know who they are at Microsoft because I work hand in hand with them setting up MSIT, but on my previous team I had no idea who they were. So I know that they can be hard to go find. So for claims transformations, yeah, these things exist. They can be helpful for generating claims that your applications expect. Typically this is helpful for you've switched domain names, but all of your apps still expect your UPNs or on-premises names to be using your old domain name. So you just say, great, your alias is Hirsch at Microsoft.com, but we actually need it to be Hirsch at Contoso because our app still expects it that way. That's where you use extract mail prefix plus a join to throw Hirsch out of the original mail address and then join it with at Contoso. Taking a look at the example policy here, this is still in public preview. It's sort of one of those features that has been in public preview forever, but that's why there's some UX. The UX for this has improved a lot inside of the Azure portal, but typically and traditionally you'll see this still implemented using a policy object that you apply. What this is doing right here is saying I want 2 new claims added to my tokens, one called name, one called country. I want you to grab it from the tenant country and the employee ID fields that exist on the user object, toss it in there. Note that name and country, even though they've got that SAML claim type, that enormous looking kind of URN identifier, that can be anything you want. There's no set of values that this has to come from. So favorite number, vacation destination, go for it. For EXTUPN and the SAML claim, I'm not sure. Let me check in on that, Brian. We're almost done, so I'll hold that question to the end so we can dig into the documentation of it. So just to talk about a little bit the security implications of claims mapping. One of the things that you noticed was that you could just pick a random name for your claim that you claim mapped in on that policy. It'd be really bad if you could set the scopes that this token has, because then you could just send that to a random application and impersonate people, which is why we don't let you do that. there's a whole list of restricted claims that are important for authentication and authorization that you can't map over. But this doesn't solve all of our problems, because if you happen to use the on-premises account name or something similar for authorization, it would still be really bad if an admin could just set up a policy and pretend to be somebody else. So that's why apps need to indicate upfront that they are taking on the risk of claims mapping, and they understand that they might get claims that have been modified by the tenant, even though they didn't necessarily understand that this was going to happen upfront. So this is why they either need to create their own sign-in key in the tenant and then check specifically for the use of that key in tokens issued by that tenant for that application. Or there's sort of just a blanket, yep, I accept the risk here value that you can set in the manifest, which is accept backed claims. You said that's true. We don't require a signing key anymore, and that's just sort of the application developer indicating, hey, I'll take on the risk here. One other big caveat, claims mapping does not apply to guest users. That's because guest users have all of their data sourced in a different tenant, and it would be really weird and bad if you could go just suck arbitrary data out of somebody else's tenant. Hey, yeah, Martin, we asked a question about that a little bit earlier. For AD users, do you specifically mean on-premises Active Directory or AAD? Microsoft Graph User Endpoint. I don't know about this one, actually. It's a really good question, though, to check in on. And AD users, okay. I don't know about that. Unfortunately, the Microsoft Graph team is a sister of ours, but this definitely seems like something that would be valuable. So we'll find out. Some documentation, just so that if you get the slide deck, this will all be available to you. Claims mapping, understanding V1 and V2, optional claims, and the group config stuff. And that's it. Kind of burnt through that fast. So let's dig into, Stephen, I think that you'll be sharing this deck itself, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. We can also just share out the link for this, or paste the doc URLs into chat. But all of this stuff is on the docs.microsoft.com under AAD. If you search optional claims AAD, you'll find it. Same thing with claims mapping and groups config. So one of the first questions was about the UPN on SAML tokens using the EXT bits. So we're going to swap over to configuring optional claims. So yeah, I think this is exactly what you're looking for here. We'll wait for the screen to catch up in a second. There we go. So like it says, the UPN can be used for both SAML and JOT responses, both V1 and V2. You would just go into here, you would set under SAML, you would say the name is the UPN, the additional properties are include externally authenticated UPN. So just like this example you have down here, instead of ID token, you would use the SAML version. Brian, does that work for you? Does that seem like it would work? Priyan, we don't have that today inside of our set of claims. We've looked at having a flag in the future about ROPC, just because that is a little bit more insecure, but everything else is not something that we're looking at exposing, just because typically it's used for more harm than good. Could you go into some details about why you want to know what flow is used for the token? Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Got it. API to API flow. So you're looking specifically at like app tokens, I think, or OVO? Like if there's a use. Okay. For app tokens, there's an easier way to figure out that it's an app token. One is that there won't be any scopes there. Oh, gotcha, Martin. Okay, I think I've worked with you before, actually. I'll definitely work with them on that. Yeah, so for app tokens, you can check to see that the object ID and the subject claim are the same. That's how you identify app-only tokens. Beyond that, they will not have any scopes. They will have roles instead, typically. You can get app tokens without any roles, though, so just be aware of that. Preen, is that sufficient for the identification that you wanted to run? We are looking at an optional claim in the future. Sorry, I thought you meant app tokens, not access tokens. Yeah, access tokens come from browser flow or the implicit flow. That's just how it works. And we don't really have a good reason right now of differentiating between them. Any other questions on the line? Gotcha, yeah. So let's take a look at that. So for claims mapping, I believe you go up through enterprise applications, you pick an application. Okay. Yeah, that's just a tenant permissions thing. You'll need to work with an admin to fix that up. Problem. You don't set it in the manifest for claims mapping. You set optional claims in the manifest. And we're working on some UX eventually that'll let you set optional claims inside of the actual Azure AD UX, but I don't have a timeline for when that will be available. Yes, that's how you set the mapped claims. That's correct. Okay. Except map claims equals true fails in the new portal. That is probably by design. So let's just take a look at this real fast. And that is because it doesn't dual write to v2, is my guess. Nope, that works. Let's just make sure that this is actually... Okay. Yeah, I'm guessing that it's a permissions issue on your end then. How long ago was this? Okay, it may have just been updated then. We're still working on this, the new app registration portal, and the team behind manifest writing is updating this all the time to make it better. Anything else? We got 10 minutes left.
So I see Alexi.
Yeah, we got some typing. So claims based on membership status within a particular group instead of setting the full list of... That is a feature that is rolling out soon. I think it might be another month or two away, but this will make requesting groups inside of the token much easier, much more straightforward. I don't have exact details, though, on when that's launching. Oh, there you go. Yep. Yeah, you probably don't have an application-specific signing key then. You can have as many policies for claims mapping as you want. I don't know exactly what happens when they overlap. However, the documentation does touch on the priority order for overlapping policies that are applied. Here we go. So I believe that policy evaluation works the same way as it does for the configurable token lifetimes. So if you have something assigned to the service principal and the parent organization, it basically goes from most specific to least specific. So that was for Priyan's question about how multiple policies overlap. Yep. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the questions and the input, especially on the MS Graph work for extension attributes. Definitely let Stephen know if there's any feedback or ideas for additional topics. I particularly liked Jeff's stuff about all the Identiverse announcements. I think that'd be a cool little post-Identiverse tour. And definitely, if you haven't heard of it or you haven't checked it out yet, Identiverse is happening right now. There's a ton of different identity things that are being announced, not just by us, but by all of the major players in this space, especially the standards and protocols bodies. One of the biggest announcements that I'm really excited about is that FIDO2 is becoming much more of a real thing, which is awesome sets of security keys that are 100% unphishable and represent 2 factors of authentication. So Yubico and Feitian both announced brand new keys that all look awesome, and I'm really hoping that Alex Simons buys some for us.
Yeah. No, yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Everybody.